Have you seen in your practice a direct correlation to some issues around mental health associated with things like social media?
Absolutely. I think this conversation, it was often kind of like the Instagram conversation for like adolescent females. And I think unfortunately, it was kind of put in that category that if you weren't a teenage girl, like social media couldn't impact you. And obviously we know now that is, very, very far from the truth. And
ladies and gentlemen, if you're hearing this, you have once again tuned The Consequence of Habit podcast and your host, JT. Hey, for the second time, I get to do one of these interviews in person, which I'm extremely excited about. This week, I sit down with Wes Jones. Wes Jones is not only a friend, but he's also a clinical social worker and therapist. We've partnered up with another 501c3 nonprofit called SL24, Unlock the Light. And there's going to be links to that organization in the show notes. And if you don't know what that is and you haven't heard about it, then I implore you guys to check that out. This was started by a gentleman named Chris Locke shortly after his son unfortunately took his own life. And it's a house at the University of Delaware that has paid mental health professionals there 24/7. It's also just a cool place to go and hang out. I think they call it like rest stop from life. So the three of us all got together and we started throwing around this idea of a digital fast or a digital diet. If anyone who's seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, well, then you understand that some of the dangers that are associated with if we just take social media in itself, and as social media, the rise of social media, so has the amount of the levels of anxiety and depression in just everybody. I don't want to put this as young adults because that would be unfair. Truth is, it's everybody. So Wes and I take some time and we start talking about the effects of digital content on the mind and what abstinence from that for 30 days might look like, how it might help you. I have all these thoughts about these things when it comes to dopamine and addiction, but they're only through my own experiences. Wes brings a whole other level to this when he brings his own education, a little bit of academic pedigree to go behind it. So without further ado, please welcome to the podcast, Wes Jones. Everybody, thanks for joining us again. This is JT here, the Consequence of Habit podcast. Today, I am joined by, actually a friend, Mr. What is the official title? I want to make sure I'm getting this. And
sure.
So what is your actual official title?
So I'm a licensed clinical social worker is my official title. Licensed
clinical social worker, Wes Jones from Counseling Associates of Delaware. Wes, it's 7 a.m.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks, man, for driving. I don't know, it was about 20 minutes to get over here to
Not that far, no.
Do this bright and early. One of the main reasons I'm having Wes on is Wes and I have partnered together to work on this little experiment, a digital fast, and we've been doing this in conjunction with SL24, which is a nonprofit that was started by Chris Locke. And Chris at one point will be coming on here. And we'll get into the backstory of how that came to be. But really, the main thing behind this is we're looking at, or we are going to do a digital fast. And how did we even get hooked up on doing this together, Wes?
Yeah, I think we started just kind of having conversations about, choices that I think each of us have kind of made in our own lives and how impactful, obviously, COVID over the last 2 years, I think has changed a lot of how we kind of evaluate our relationships with, certain things. And, digital content is clearly one of them that I think people are reevaluating, the role it plays in their lives. And it's not going anywhere. So it's something we need to learn how to navigate. And I think that kind of out of that conversation, it kind of snowballed into kind of where we are today.
Yeah. And I remember it was probably a year and a half ago, you and I were at a lacrosse game because both our kids play lacrosse. And we started talking about kind of our own journey and looking at things like breath work and cold exposure. And I think that conversation like sparked something where we started sharing some like different books we were reading and one of the books that came up was Digital Minimalism. And I was, had you read that book? But when we started discussing it,
I'd heard of it, but hadn't read it, but shortly thereafter picked it up and really enjoyed it.
Is that when you started implementing things in your own life? Because just a little backstory, Wes has got a philosophy around his digital content or I should say the way he consumes it. I respected the fact that like I could text you and you may not get back for a while, and it's not because you're blowing me off. It's because you've put barriers, right? You've put in what's the word?
Like binding strategies, or spaces in between, my physical space and access to things that I could potentially use more than what I would really want to.
Yeah, and I now was that. How long had you been doing that? By the time I kind of sent you that link for the book.
So I'd say generally a few years, maybe 3 or 4 years in some form, in trying some different things, and then really. I'd say probably about 3 months into COVID, so somewhere at the end of the spring of 2020, realizing TV is on too long, phone's in my hand too long, and this is outside of doing work or doing things that were purposeful, and kind of made a decision at that point to just kind of remove those things from my phone, and found that when I did, I wasn't accessing them really at all. I wasn't like downloading it again. I think that the quality of the interactions that I was having were much better. I was getting better at kind of implementing. Usually I'll put my phone on the kitchen island when I walk in the house. So if I ever need it, I kind of go to it as opposed to, being on the couch or, being in the bedroom. And I kind of established those as two places that I really didn't want to bring technology into. Those were places that I wanted to be able to be more connected with the people that I'm sharing that space with.
So you kind of started a digital, I wouldn't say it's a digital fast, but you had those kind of hard guidelines around the way you consume digital content. Now, were you a social media guy ever? That just wasn't something that kind
No, I was. I've been on Facebook since 2009.
Okay.
So... it's interesting. I never looked at how much I was on, but I would say probably a few hours a week, maybe a little bit more. I never really had got it. By the time I made some of those changes, I never really thought just how much I was using it. I did realize that I was using it as kind of like a filler, and it really wasn't providing any content for me. The things that I wanted to see would be college buddies that were, living out of state and what they were doing.
Yeah.
But I could see all that in a few minutes. And after that, there really wasn't much value, although I was still doing it longer than what I really felt I needed.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have Wes on is as we get near this digital fast that we're going to be, it's going to be students from University of Delaware. I believe it's going to be a handful. It's going to be like 10 to 15 people that are going to volunteer. Because even in my own life, man, and I've said it here before, like I'm low-lying fruit for things like digital or social media, there is undoubtedly an addictive trait to these things. In your practice, have you seen, you've been doing this now, before we hit record, you came up with a number of 20, how many?
Almost 22 years now. It'll be 22 years this spring.
22 years. So you've seen this. You've seen this kind of throughout the years as the rise of social media. Have you seen in your practice a direct correlation to some issues around mental health associated with things like social media?
Absolutely. I think this conversation, it was often kind of like the Instagram conversation for like adolescent females. And I think unfortunately, it was kind of put in that category that if you weren't a teenage girl, like social media couldn't impact you. And obviously we know now that is, very, very far from the truth. And that's just kind of one sample kind of explanation of how impactful it can be. And I think that's where a lot of adults probably distance themselves from, that demographic, feeling like, well, I'm an adult. I don't use it in that way. I'm not comparing myself to people, but very often they're subject to the same insecurities. It might not be another model or something like that. It could be a family they might try to compare themselves to that might not be realistic. So I think we've had this kind of evolution of how we consume that type of information, and I think we now clearly understand that it doesn't really matter your age or gender. There are going to be slight variances and differences based upon that, but generally, I think anyone's kind of susceptible to overusing these platforms just because of how they're designed to be used.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a cop-out, right? It's really easy for adults to say, oh, no, it's the teenagers. It's the teenage girls that are having a real problem. And I mean, you would know better than I do, right? There has to be some science, right? There has to be some science behind the teenage mind, right? This whole prefrontal cortex not being fully developed. But I think to say that it's just teenagers is just a way that some adults, they'll portray that because it makes them feel like they're still in charge or they're still in control. Yeah. But the reality is, and I'm going to go off just my own experiences. I know people just as hooked on LinkedIn as a teenager on Instagram. Like there's not that much difference. I don't know if something you agree with or.
No, I think, almost, I was thinking of this probably a couple months ago, but when Snapchat first came out about 11 years ago, it had a very kind of linear usage. Basically you could send a picture, it would disappear. It was very captivating for certain audiences.
Sure.
And, now if you look at it now, teenagers don't text if they might be on a group chat for a sports team or an activity, but that is solely their platform. And it's kind of grown into something that they, in some ways, can't live without because most of their communication is done through that. So there's been an incredible, I think, evolution here over the last handful of years to where these platforms have just, created a space in our day-to-day lives. And some of them are easier to create some distances to, but very often some can be much more challenging to because, they're how we communicate with people.
Yeah. That's why it's an interesting time for you to even make that decision in your own life, right? Because we're into COVID. We're at a time where we're feeling more isolated than ever. And there's this dichotomy about connection over things like social media where, in theory, you should feel more connected with lots of people. But a lot of times it has the complete opposite effect on people. They feel more alone, right? And then they feel this constant need for affirmation from almost complete strangers, which is it's crazy. So on the clinical side, what do you think's going on? What is this tapping into in the brain? What is this hook that has kind of gotten into so many of us?
I think for many people, it's kind of your reward pathway. I think that the best way I've ever heard it kind of described, and I think it really makes a lot of sense when you look at it through this lens, is it kind of mirrors, gambling addiction. And, clinically as a clinician, gambling for a long time was kind of this like outsider diagnosis, that, can you be addicted to something that you can't consume? And, up until the DSM-5 was updated, probably 12 years ago now, it wasn't even included, as a clinical diagnosis.
Wait, just real quick, what is just?
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So
okay.
It's a book that's used that has diagnostic criteria for mental health disorders.
Okay.
And so addictions historically has always been separate from mental health, and this goes back, really into time. But generally speaking, the last 10 to 15 years, we realize, they're really in the same space. It's your mind and how you're interacting with things. So, kind of comparing it or looking at it as similar to, gambling, meaning that if you're playing slots or you're doing something that's going to have some level of a dopamine release, a pleasure release, something that's going to kind of connect you in, social media often has that same interaction, the endless scroll, kind of going until you hit something, you like something, you get a little reward, you keep going. And kind of similar to gambling, you don't always win. You don't always get the reward. You do sometimes get the reward on the chase. And, the chase could just be looking at things and not really getting stimulated and hoping that you find something that you like, something that interacts with you, makes you laugh. But then it just sets you up to kind of continue to go until you find something.
It is strange that, you wouldn't think that this thing would, this endless scrolling. Like, so Facebook has, and they all do, right? They all have, you could scroll through your feed, and then they'll have some video that pops out. You tap that video, and then it's just, you scroll down to the next one. And I'll tell you what, man, that is such a rabbit hole. I think you mentioned you just did just kind of an experiment recently, right? Like you said, before bed, you started doing that. And it's unbelievable how easy you could spend an hour could be gone.
Yep.
You've lost an hour of your day just mindlessly scrolling through nothing, fights, car, cars, anything, right? It's just, I don't know. I don't even know. Like when we talk about the gambling side of that, was that something that we've just realized over the past, say, 5 years? I mean, how have you seen it played out within your practice? Where, let me back up because I'm just rambling. What was the first time that you started to make this connection between patients that maybe are struggling a little bit, and then maybe the dopamine release that they're seeking through digital content?
I'd say that level probably 3 or 4 years ago. I think the not being able to put it down. I think it kind of that kind of bled into some of like the gaming space. Things that are kind of programmed. That can be highly addictive. So I'd say probably 3, 4, maybe even 5 years ago, I think there's been just a lot more information out there here over the last few years that I think has been kind of digestible for the masses, that everyone can kind of look at and see and understand. And I think that has really probably brought a lot of these conversations to the surface, where people will, I'll ask them purposely, could you not do something for a period of time? So something I would typically do with alcohol, marijuana usage, where I would ask someone, could you take 30 days off? Could you not use this substance for 30 days? And let's just have a conversation about it. I'm not asking you to never do it again. I'm not asking you to change your life in any other way, but to gain perspective over your relationship. And, to be able to have perspective over something, you can't do it when you're embedded with it, when you're using it daily. And that kind of evolved into, encouraging people to take a break from, a certain social media platform that they might use, or even a game that they might play, just to evaluate their relationship with it and encourage them to have a more purposeful interaction, as opposed to, I did this for 30 hours this week. I probably only wanted to do it for 5. Well, that's a lot of time that you're using something not in a purposeful manner.
Yeah, even when I presented this idea to even members on the board, it was like, well, what about just cutting back? How about we just cut back? And when we talk about the science and we put it in the same classifications as gambling and alcohol and drugs, we know that that doesn't work, right? You tell somebody who can't stop drinking, well, just cut back on the amount of beers you're having tonight, and let's see how that goes. In the perfect world, that would be a solution. What happens in the brain when you have, all right, so we're just going to throw 30 days out there because that's just a really common number to put out there. What happens in that process in your brain and that distancing that you're giving yourself and whatever that thing is? What can somebody expect?
So I think, looking at the brain and, the brain's ability to engage with what's called like neurogenesis, or ability to kind of regrow cells and rethink how we look at things. And, with heavy drugs, methamphetamines, opiates, it does significant damage to the brain's ability to regenerate, to be able to think differently. For most other substances, and this has been known for a little bit of time now, marijuana, alcohol, we're seeing it much more, in kind of the digital media space, that it doesn't take your brain a tremendous amount of time to reestablish these neural pathways. So really just a few weeks, your brain will begin to be able to, any kind of mild withdrawal symptoms you might be having, you're kind of past that stage. So when you don't have the physical discomfort, you can deal with some of the psychological discomfort. And really it's in those probably last 2 weeks of the month where people can, what I call like metacognate, which is an executive functioning skill, is kind of just zoom out, on that relationship and evaluate, its role in your life, and then to try to make a determination of, changes you would want to make, and it doesn't work for all people. Some people will say, I can't, I don't want to. Or, I realize that this is too much and I would like to find balance. And we'd have a conversation regarding like harm reduction strategies, which essentially would be creating barriers in their life to not be able to abuse something or to do something too much that would be negative for them. But I'd say generally, for what we're talking about here in kind of the digital space, a few weeks for the brain to begin to think a little bit differently. to break that habituation of, and really follows a lot of the same research around, building in a routine, is, when you do these things, consecutively every day, for a few weeks and a month, the mind's ability to change happens. This is just the other side of it.
Yeah.
You're trying to bind yourself from those things, so you can break that pattern.
Yeah. What is the word that you use for when someone just grabs their phone out of their pocket? Like how many times a day? I've heard you say it before. Well, say you're standing in line at the grocery store, and we're not even thinking about the fact that we're just reaching into our phone, and because we're bored, because we're uncomfortable, whatever it is, it's this easy access to nonstop. I don't even say dopamine release. It's the chase of the dopamine. When we go back to the comparing it to gambling. Like I know personally, one of the first things I said, well, hey, I'm doing this too much. I'm on my phone too much. I'm going to turn the notifications off. And that was not, that almost makes things worse because now you don't know if you've got something on there and it's always calling you. Say, hey, let me check my email, see if there's something on there. How do you, I would say with this, the people that we're going to do this experiment with, these are people that clearly have volunteered to do something because they know it plays a big part in their life. What do you hope that people are gained from going through this? In the perfect world, 30 days after we start this, people look back at this kind of experiment. What do you want people to get from it?
I hope that they gain some perspective of, their relationship with what they're using. And, to be honest, that they would look to kind of prioritize, higher fidelity or higher meaning interactions. And for each of them to identify what that might be. And it could be someone saying, I want to use these platforms because it allows me to connect with my family who's very distant. I don't get to see them forever.
Yeah.
But more deliberate usage of those platforms. And I think some of the questions we'll probably get into with this group is, how many people have been at a red light and they grab their phone just to look at something quick in the bathroom, while someone's having a conversation while they're watching maybe their favorite Netflix series, but they're still on their phone, simultaneously doing something. Like, is that a good use of our interaction? Are we being purposeful? Are we just kind of pacifying a little bit of a connection there or attempted, connection for a moment of time?
Yeah.
And I think my hope is that most people would see that those wouldn't be considered deliberate usages, of the technology. They're already doing other things that are really important, hence driving your car.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the word deliberate, right? Because that is the thing, like I said, you don't even realize a lot of times that you're doing it. And I think I can only compare it to some of my own experiences and even like around alcohol where, and you talk about being kind of embedded in it and it's very hard to see things in real time. But as you distance yourself from something, you can really analyze whether it's had a negative effect on your life, right? So anyone who's quit drugs or alcohol, when they start to get away from it, you can really see, I really, maybe there was definitely a problem there. And the further I got away from it, the more I realized how it kind of monopolized my life, right? These different aspects of my life were affected by it in some way. And I can honestly say, man, from being in airports a lot, my own experiences, how many, like you said, stoplights, this thing with the cell phone, we're living through an experiment in real time. And I do feel like we're going to look back at this at some point. And it's almost like smoking in the 60s or something that we had no idea the damage that it was doing, in the moment because it was so new. It was new technology. How do you, knowing what you know and having teenagers, right? How do you kind of navigate this within your own life?
It's tough. I have two teenage daughters, so these are conversations that, let's say / at times battles, that we have all the time. So it starts with, if we're having dinner together, phones face down, definitely out at a restaurant, or even, not even bringing them in, or if we're eating at the kitchen table to not have them around. I think it's, people think that this is easy, or maybe people don't think it's easy, but it's a constant conversation. It's nothing that often you just, do. It's like if everyone wanted to exercise to be healthy, it means everyone would exercise for 45 minutes, 5 days a week, and they'd hit all their health goals. So it's a constant, kind of pulling back and going back into where, kind of reevaluating, how things are and trying to move back towards that balance. And I think that's where, sometimes we don't, give the justice of just how challenging some of these things are, that this isn't like a yes or a no or a success or a failure. It's a journey, it's a journey and it's a process. And through that process, there's going to be struggles, just like in addiction where there's relapse and people having an open space to be open and honest. But a lot of these are conversations that kind of evolve over time and in hopes that people will, continue to seek, purposeful usage of things that can, have addictive properties to them.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges we have in doing this is we're two guys in our 40s.
Yeah.
Right. And we're talking to college age kids during this. We've already recognized the fact that that adults can be just as hooked on this as anybody else. But how do we do this without provoking any type of shame, right? Like, because that's the last thing I know either one of us want to do. We're just recognizing the fact that this is a powerful, addictive thing in our pocket all the time, right? If it's not in our pocket, it's next to our bed. So how do we have these conversations with people that may think that we don't understand how things are in their life without invoking shame? Like how do we go about doing that?
It's a good question because you don't want a shame response, right? You don't want a guilt response from someone. You want that that acceptance. You want that space for them to be open and honest, free of judgment. And although in each of our brains generally the same thing happens, I do believe that there are certain, kind of points of life or ages where, so much of your life is very much, kind of intertwined into some of these platforms. We were talking about this before. You said, do I have LinkedIn? I said, I don't, I'm, in a space in my life where I don't really need it and don't have a desire to it. If I was 23, just putting my, head out there and wanting to make, connections, I probably would have it. So I realized that even in my space, some of the things that I don't necessarily need, based upon where I am in my career, someone who's just entering into that space might not have that luxury or, want to use it for the usefulness of connecting with other people. My hope is, probably one of my famous quotes, which I will absolutely butcher, but maybe you can go back later on and get the actual quote. Eckhart Tolle has a quote around kind of anxiety and being present in the moment. And essentially, what he's saying there is that anxiety can't exist in the present moment, and you're in a conscious moment, like right now. And really it can only exist in the future and the past. And, so much of the things that we do invoke, thoughts of the future or something from the past and take us away from our present. So, the more we can kind of be present, and encouraging those individuals, what does that look like? Sometimes I'll ask a student, well, if you're going to go on spring break, you're going to go on vacation, post your pictures when you get back. I'm not saying don't do that, but how much engagement are you going to be about that trip if you're constantly updating things and seeing how people engage with it? It's not allowing you to be present. You think about what I would say is probably the overuse of the term anxiety. Yes, we all feel anxious. We biologically need to feel anxious. It's an important protective mechanism. But think of how much those types of things just take us away from being present in the moment. It'll be like us talking here, having this great conversation, and I grab my phone and I'm checking, stats from the games yesterday.
Sure.
I'm not being present with you, and losing that connection opportunity.
Yeah, I've struggled with like how do we package this? Because having my own experiences around addiction, shame is this overwhelming blanket over things, and when you point out the things that need to be pointed out, sometimes that can be that's shame invoking within itself, right? So I shouldn't say struggle, but I've thought a lot about how to navigate that throughout this process. I know it is easy for me to say, hey, I'm hooked on this stuff just as much as you guys are. So this is going to be happening to both of us. All these feelings that you're going to have over these next 30 days, I'm there with you. And I even thought about going through this digital fast myself before we did this. But I think that there's something about having those emotions, those feelings of kind of being raw at the same time. And, even talking about this stuff, it is strange to have these conversations because this stuff hasn't been around that long. Obviously, the movie Social Dilemma came out and it kind of put things on the forefront, but then it goes away, right? There's another movie that comes out and we stop having these conversations. And this thing is so ingrained to our everyday that I think one of the comments that somebody just had, one of the students that we spoke to, was a lot of people know it's a problem, but they're not really willing to do anything about it. And which is a scary thing, right? That's a scary kind of place to be. I think one of the ways that we can do it is we talk about free will. We discuss, hey, do you think you have free will? Yes or no? And a lot of people think that they do, right? But when we truly break down and we analyze, again, I'm going to use the word monopolize, how much of your day is monopolized by this device, this thing that you spend money on every single month, and it takes away from a deeper connection, not only with yourself, but with others. I think that is one way for people maybe to realize, like, this drug dealer is somebody you pay every single month, and it could be Verizon, it could be like whoever your carrier is. Do you think that's a little too extreme? Like, how do we have these conversations and talking about heavy words like addiction and dopamine and withdrawals when it's something that's just so common within society right now?
I think two things. One thing that is important is that sometimes, and we see this in the mental health space, sometimes we see this in the medical community, is that there's kind of a detachment from the provider and the client or the patient, meaning that, like, assuming that the provider or the doctor, physician, whoever has it all together, they got it all figured out. And I think social media definitely drives that, right? Like, this person has this persona or this thing, and it creates this kind of unrealistic expectation and almost like attributes of what we call like the perfectionist is shield, right? So if someone is perceived to be better than someone else or more knowledgeable or free of these challenges, there's a barrier to connection, intimacy. Like, you can't connect with someone who you feel is different. You can look up to them, you can be jealous of them, but you can't be on par with them. So often I'll kind of start with, like, this is a relationship of equals. We're going at this together, and you can ask me any question that you want to ask me, and I'll ask you some questions, and obviously you have the right to say you're not comfortable asking those questions. But I think to the second part would be, I don't think people realize how much they're using those apps, their phone. And something I started doing over the summer and have used until this year is, even part of my intake will be, having people go through their screen time usage. You think there's 168 hours in a week. We're supposed to sleep for roughly about 40 of them. If you're working or a student, there's another 35 or 40, for some 50 or 60. At that point, you're in, the 70, 80 hour range of time left. And, it's not uncommon for me to see people with weekly kind of screen time usage on their phone, just their phone. This isn't other devices. This isn't gaming.
Sure.
70, 80 hours.
Wow.
And it's shocking. They never would think it would be that way. And often it's, when we do like drinking journals in recovery, how much are you drinking? People go back, and if they actually document it, they're often, underreporting, just like you do in gambling.
Sure.
You don't report the losses. You don't report everything you do. And with that consciousness, I think you can make changes.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, that's going to give people anxiety, right? Pulling those numbers up. And I think even a conversation you and I had, I compared it to bringing your recycling container out on for me, it was on a Sunday, right? And feeling that container, how heavy it was of empty thing, and hearing the bottles kind of hitting each other and the cans. And to me, that was my checking my screen time and seeing exactly, because I didn't think I could fill a recycling container, so I think there is a lot of power in that. I like that this is a relationship of equals, and this isn't the old guys pointing fingers, and saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. It's recognizing the fact that you have a dopamine response to something that in itself is addictive. We do this for, like you said, 70, 80 hours in a week for years. And if you think that that's not going to have an effect on you, it's not going to have an effect on your, even the homeostasis of your dopamine levels in general. And maybe that's where we'll go. If just because you're coming from this with a lot more, with a broad education, a little more street cred when it comes to talking about things of the brain, can you explain the dopamine process? And then if you're exposed to it, you seek it over a long period of time, what happens in the brain when it's taken away? And what are some of those emotions that we could expect from that?
Yeah, I think if you hold your hands, up in front of you and you hold them about maybe 6 or 8 inches apart, and if you assume that space is homeostasis, like that's kind of your balance. Your left hand is your pleasure side. Like that's the dopamine reward on really anything. That could be, having a cup of coffee here this morning, you're going to get a little bit of enjoyment out of that. That could be all the way to, doing opiates or doing, heavy drugs, and really everything in between. And when we constantly kind of hit that pleasure side, we do tug our balance, really kind of out of balance or out of homeostasis. And, when we habituate that, we continually do that, it makes it very difficult for us to regulate our discomfort. And I think, social media has definitely driven that kind of escapism or those little rewards, and has, I think, made it very difficult for people to deal with any level of emotional distress, definitely physical distress. There's been a lot of research here recently, strategies that have been around for hundreds of years, to kind of try to push that balance back in the other side. Clinically, this would be like exposure work, with people with social anxiety, who would, restrict their social interactions. Their social world will get smaller and smaller. There's illusion of comfort because they're not doing the things that they used to do. But we would work on, an exposure list. So they would, kind of create a hierarchy of, things that they would do. And you would start to very little kind of push that to kind of soothe that anxiety and make it more comfortable for them. I think there are very similar strategies you can look at around social media of, pushing these levels of discomfort in spaces where people haven't had to, although I'd say many people will say they're very uncomfortable, in that world.
Yeah. And recognizing like, hey, I get it's just your phone. I get it's just social media, but again, getting back to the science, like it's addictive, and it's kind of going to suck for 2 weeks. And if we accept that going into it, and not sugarcoat it and be like, hey, this is just put your phone down. Just put your phone down. It's like telling a gambler, just stop gambling. Yeah. Dude. What's wrong with you? Do you have no self-discipline? And that's not what this is about, right? We understand, especially when we start getting stressed, is that mechanism in the brain, when we talk about discipline, when we start to feel uncomfortable, that muscle memory of going right to what's going to soothe that, right? It's like our pacifier as an adult to feel better. I almost compare your inability to kind of deal with those uncomfortable moments. And you correct me if I'm wrong. We can go back to, and this isn't direct comparison, but we talk about like pain pills, right? Yeah. Pain pills are a really common thing. The opioid crisis is, we've certainly felt it around here. When we're on prolonged medication for pain, and then that's taken away, that we're more sensitive to pain because your body's trying to fight this constant kind of trying to get back in that homeostasis. What is a normal level or sensitivity towards things? Would you say that falls in the same realm as far as our own We'll be more sensitive to not being distracted, to sitting in our own thoughts, our own uncomfortableness.
Absolutely. I would say, definitely not to the level of opiates.
Of course.
But very similar, neurologically in our brain, how dopamine is released. Absolutely. And that's why when you think in addictions, it's, those initial stages of discomfort, especially physiological discomfort, are very fragile, and very fragile around. As soon as you interact with that substance again, you've just rewarded yourself, at least your brain, to kind of soothe yourself for that moment. Unfortunately, what happens is, and then very shortly thereafter, there's the kind of shame guilt space of a relapse. Yeah. And, where communities like AA and NA have been, kind of the, very welcoming, where you can have that kind of accountability with empathy space to where like, hey, we're working on this together. We're not going to shame you. We're not going to blame you. We're going to have an open door. I brought this, I have a neuro group that I meet with once a month, and we're talking about doing some of these quality of life metrics, questionnaires with these students before and after. And, their concern was that, they were worried that people are really going to have some significant levels of discomfort, that we really needed to be mindful of just how difficult this might be for people, very similar to, abstaining from marijuana or alcohol for 30 days. And it was interesting, and that was kind of broad, not only from the person leading to the group, but my other colleagues as well, was something that really stuck out for them, felt that, based upon just on the brain's reward system, that this would be kind of equally as uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think one of the challenges we have is because this is so new and they don't have those processes in place or those communities in place, I think it's going to be a growing field. But where if you're in AA or NA or something like that and you start struggling, you're on the verge of picking up a bottle, doing something, the first thing they tell you to do is call your sponsor, right? Call somebody and they're going to be there for you. These structures aren't all in place yet when it comes to around things like digital content. What are some of the tools that other than saying, accept the fact that this is going to be hard? Yeah. We have to equip people with more than just that. What is some of the advice that you give somebody when they, you send them off? You're going to go without whatever for the next 30 days. Understanding it's going to be hard, but when it gets hard, try this.
Yeah, I would start typically with, some psychoeducation around how that engagement looks and how much control you really don't have over what you see. And I think for people who don't know that or don't understand that process of how algorithms work and how what is kind of being put to them on their For You page really is related to things that they've liked, things that they've followed, things that they've hovered on, how long they've watched certain videos. All of those things get programmed into the next thing that they see. So they're not really selecting those things. Those things have been selected for them. And my hope is with that level of consciousness, they can be more deliberate, with wanting to make those choices. I think another part is, starts with kind of understanding how these things work, preparing themselves for some level of discomfort, and encouraging them to, kind of seek support, to talk about it, not, externalize or not internalize it. So that might be letting some friends know, say, hey, I'm going to kind of go off my socials for about a month. Just want to give you a heads up. So there's not this, kind of fear of missing out or, people worrying about them by not engaging, but really kind of starting with those first two steps.
Yeah. Yeah. How about when they're sitting there and, they're we talk about this space between an impulse and an action, right? Where you've got this split second to maybe stop for a second and go, all right, this is going to be my next move. I know I shouldn't do this. So I'm going to try something else. Are there some things that you recommend people could do instead of? Because we know we're going to have a whole lot of time to fill. Yeah. Like we've got some people have 70, 80 hours to fill. We have to fill that time with something. I mean, even in early recovery for me, I think I had somebody, things like a coloring book were like a common thing, like just something to take up your time because inevitably you're going to have a lot of it. So you have to have a plan going into this to maybe to help mitigate some of those feelings that you're inevitably going to be feeling?
So I think the next part would be identifying what are those high value things, meaningful, purposeful things that they would want to be doing. So you're already accepting that you're going to have this kind of net time, that if you don't fill or you don't engage with in some way, it's going to make it much more difficult to stop doing the thing you're trying to stop doing. So getting people individually to identify, that might be read a book, that could be go to the gym, it could be spending a little bit more time with some friends that they have not connected with, but being purposeful and deliberate with that time. And I think that's an aspect of just being present in the moment.
Yeah.
That sometimes social media can take you away from.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we spoke about, like having everyone write down. And this is something that I'm going to do myself. What do we hope to achieve? What do you've already come to the conclusion that this is taking up a large portion of your life, or I shouldn't say large, too much of your life that you're uncomfortable with. Yeah. So having that written down and having it in a place where you could see it, because this constant reminder of hey man, struggle is necessary. Friction is necessary for growth. We have to go through these uncomfortable things. It doesn't matter if you're working out, whatever it is, you're going to be uncomfortable, but we have a goal, right? We have something that we know we want to achieve. And just like working out or being on a diet, some days you're going to fall off. Yeah. We're going to try not to, right? We're going to do everything. We're going to have a plan in place. We're going to do everything we can to help mitigate that. But at the same time, if it does, that this is not a throw in the towel, I'm going right back to scrolling for the next 12 hours.
No, I think, in failure wouldn't even be, wouldn't even want to use that word, sure. But when someone, struggles with something, to me, it's just a great conversation, because I think, if people can detach from that shame and guilt and to truly say, like, this was really difficult, this was more difficult than what I thought, there's a beautiful conversation there.
Yeah.
And we're just not programmed to necessarily deal with that vulnerability. People are going to say, like, they'll lie or say, I was fine, it was no big deal.
Yeah.
But it is another opportunity to confront, how difficult some of these changes can be.
Yeah, I think opportunity is a great word.
Yeah.
I think it's the perfect word that if you're struggling, I mean, if anything, that is a sign that you've got a bigger opportunity than you thought you did to make a positive change in your life. And it is, you're talking about social media, and I don't want to just harp on just that, because we know things like video games and YouTube scrolling is just as addictive. But this idea that on social media that vulnerability isn't something that we promote very much, right? It's this shiny image of ourselves. It's this shiny coin version of us. So it's a difficult thing to at the same time look at and then be vulnerable enough to say, I'm struggling with this. This is a surface level connection that I have with a whole bunch of people. It's taken a huge portion of my life. And it's having a negative effect on me mentally. And to be honest with you, I'm shocked that it's taken so long to make that connection between addiction and mental health, as if those two don't kind of live in each other's backyard all the time. Because I think I'm going to guess that most people, that if they've had an issue around digital content, will find themselves leaning on that more in times that they're not comfortable in their own brain.
Absolutely. Really, when I was going through graduate school, and this is just over 20 years ago, addiction and mental health were squarely in different places. If someone was dealing with depression or anxiety, it was not uncommon for a psychiatrist to not prescribe medication until that person abstained from substances.
Wow.
And obviously that's vastly changed, and now these are conversations. But yes, those two were really, really separate for quite some time. And, now we are here 20 some years later, and we're definitely mixing in those conversations and aspects, but it's not too far in our past to where those things were really, really treated differently.
Yeah, that's wild. Because I know even for myself, like food.
Yeah.
When I'm not in a great place, there's a reason when people quit something, and I'm interested in seeing the connection in this too. when you quit something like alcohol or drugs, one of the first things people do is they start consuming an insane amount of sugar.
Yeah.
You know, and at first I'm like, well, it's just the fact that when you consume alcohol, that metabolizes into a sugar in your body, and so I don't have that, and that's what I'm craving. But I'm curious to see when it comes to this on if people will start having more of a sweet tooth because we're looking for this dopamine release in your brain, and you know. And not to say people are going to be hooked on sugar, but you know, they say like addiction is like water; it's going to find the crack, and it's going to, if you seal up one here, it's going to go over here. So, have you heard of that? Have you seen that within your own practice?
Absolutely. I think when you think of, just because it is set up on one thing or you've been compulsive with something doesn't mean you can't be compulsive with something else. It still operates in the same system. And I think, and once again, even in addiction to where, historically there's AA and NA, they were kind of separate, even though you will see a little bit more interaction. But you've talked to an old school person that's been in recovery for, 20, 30 years, like they maybe sometimes still see them as being different. Enter in kind of technology and other things that we can abuse, be it food or whatever, it can migrate to something else. You can be addictive with something else.
Yeah, I think it's a blanket. I think when people feel a certain way, they're going to find whatever it is. We've seen it with eating disorders and addiction to sex or even work. It's, you mentioned the word distraction, and I think we'll find something to distract ourselves with, because sitting in whatever's making you uncomfortable sucks.
Yeah.
It's not easy. All right. So I kind of have a recap. Let's kind of break down how this digital fast is going to work, what the process is going to look like over that month, and some of the plans that we have in place as this thing goes on. So I think we set the date February 22nd. Good, I almost said 21st. February 22nd.
02/22/22.
All right, so this is we're going to have kind of a control group, but this is going to be obviously going out before that, and I want everyone to know that you are more than welcome to join. We're going to be setting something up on the website as well with some tools, some things to kind of help people along. The initial thing is we're going to bring people in. We're going to send out, let me back up. We're going to send an email with some of what we're doing, expectations of what this is going to look like. We're going to bring people in, and we're going to talk about the science. We're going to talk about what this thing does to your brain, how it gets you hooked. And then analyze. We have to do a digital audit.
Yeah.
Right. Everyone has to look at their own consumption of how we take in these things. So what is the one thing that is monopolizing your time that is not adding value? So whether that be your Instagram, whether it be your video games, with your YouTube, whatever it is. And that's going to be part of your digital fast. You're going to look at it and go, all right, well, I'm going to cut this out for 30 days. With the understanding that some things have to be part of your day. So whether that's something how you make a living, if you're going to school, if it has to do with personal safety, then those things don't fall within that classification. And then when we meet with these people, on your side, as the therapist talking to these students, what are some of the things that you want to discuss and kind of get across to them?
Yeah, I think, and that was a good start there, JT. I think you mentioned the term audit, and if someone was meeting with a dietitian and they wanted to make dietary changes, one of the first things that they would do is a food journal. Dietitians want to know, what are you putting in your body? How is your body responding? What are you eating on a daily basis? And then they would probably review that with them at like the second appointment. And really, this digital content is the same space. It's just evaluating how much you're using it, what's beneficial, as you said, is it work related? Is it safety related? And try to understand what is things that aren't bringing, if it was food, bringing health into your life in balance. And if it's digital content, what isn't doing that? And using that as kind of a starting point. I think after the education piece and understanding, how their brains work, we're going to start with doing a quality of life metric, doing an assessment, a self-report, a scale on each individual's quality of life. And that will go into questions around, deliberate usage of their time and what brings the most value. And the hope is that, through this process, and a term I've been using much more over the last year has been kind of philosophy. We think when it's a philosophy, it's something that we've created ourselves, and working them through, developing a philosophy with what they want their relationship to be. And to use these groups, we're going to meet 4 times, so 4 weeks in a row, where we'll have kind of an education didactic piece, something that'll have some information, but probably spend a good chunk of that meeting what would be considered like a process group, just people sharing their experiences, what it's been like for them, areas where it's been difficult, where maybe they found some successes, and allowing that group dynamic to support them, through this month.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. Yeah. I'm excited to have these kind of groups show up, and I think it's going to take a little time for people maybe to lower their guards and realize that there's power in building connection through struggle, and when you do that as part of a group, you can really start to relate with other people, even in people that maybe you didn't think you would. Like I can always go back to my own process where I walked into a room for my first 12-step. I'm like, I have nothing in common with any of these people. And then you realize, no, I have one very distinct thing in common. We all share a goal. Yeah. These people that are going to show up for this, man, first of all, it takes courage. So I commend them. And then I say, you're going to build a connection because you're going to struggle. Yeah. This is not going to be easy. But at the end of this thing, even if you're, again, I don't want to use the word, if you struggle more than somebody else, that's not the end all be all. Yeah. That's to realize that this is part of a process. This is part of a journey, and to commend you for even beginning this thing, because I think there's a real, it takes a special person to face things that are a problem, but most of us will do nothing about. So I'm excited to see the direction this goes, and I'm really excited for people to partner along with this thing, and when it's done, look back and go, hey, flip the script on the fear of missing out. Yeah. When we write down what do we hope to achieve, that's what you should have the fear of missing out on, not these quick. I don't want to say dopamine hits, because Dr. Huberman has corrected me on the word that it's hit, but realizing if I forego, if I push off this immediate need to feel good, that there's a greater good from that. There's a deeper sense of self. There's a deeper sense of connection that comes along with that. And I don't even know if the word discipline is the right one, but there's a freedom from that discipline, right? There's this feeling of accomplishment and freedom that I hope we all find from this whole thing.
Yeah, and to that point, we use the metric happiness, like people, I want to be happy, and all the research that's been done on happiness, is rooted in meaning, purpose, and connection. That drives happiness. Happiness doesn't drive those other things. And finding those spaces of meaning, doing deliberate things, purpose, being, with other people, and connection, once again, being with other people. I hope is that will drive some of these positive changes for those folks.
Awesome. Wes, I'm excited for this. I appreciate you coming here at 7 a.m. Is there anything else you want to run over? Something else you want to cover about this at all?
No, I'm excited. I'm really excited about this process, and I can't wait to kind of debrief, after our last session and get some feedback from the students that were involved, and really see where we can go with this, and ultimately how this can be helpful for individuals. So no, I'm excited to get going on the 22nd of February and seeing where this conversation goes with those folks.
Yeah, likewise. Like I said, anyone who wants to join us on this thing, we're going to have a sign up on the website. Jump on there. If this is something that I shouldn't even say struggle, at least you've acknowledged that it's taken too much of your life. Any of the live stuff I've done, even on like Clubhouse or just Clubhouse. I was going to list a bunch of other things, but that'd be a lie. On Clubhouse around habits, this is the one thing that has really overwhelmingly been the at the forefront, is how much time I'm spending on my phone. How much time am I not present with my loved ones? How much time is this? how is my digital content compromising me from doing these other things that we know make us feel good?
Yeah.
So, Wes, I appreciate you coming on, man.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Everybody, that's a wrap. Like always, thanks again for checking us out. This show is brought to you by the team here at Consequence of Habit and is an arm of our 501c3 nonprofit. The show is produced and edited by the one and only Anthony Palmer and is part of the Palm Tree Pod Company network of podcasts. And that's it. I'll catch you guys next week.